Imagine getting fined hundreds of dollars for fishing on your own private lake, on land you paid for, maintain, and live on. Sounds insane, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. But instead of backing down, I did something the HOA never saw coming. I bought their precious pond and shut it down for good. Here's how it all went down. I couldn't believe what I was reading. A letter from the Homeowners Association showed up in my mailbox, a fine of $300 for fishing. Fishing, of all things. Not trespassing, not illegal dumping, not anything remotely criminal. Just me, casting a line into the peaceful water of my own lake, nestled on my private fenced property, 30 acres of land that I purchased 5 years ago, fair and square, after months of searching for the perfect rural retreat. The lake is something I maintain myself. I stock it with bass and trout every spring, clear out the algae, test the water quality, and ensure the ecosystem stays healthy. It's not public. It's not shared. It's not even visible from the road. That's what stunned me the most. The letter claimed I was violating community recreational use rules, as if I lived in some suburban development with shared green space and kiddie pools. But I don't. I live miles away from their neighborhood. I've never attended one of their meetings. I've never signed their bylaws. My land was part of an original ranch development that later got carved into smaller plots, some of which did get absorbed into the HOA. Mine didn't, or so I thought. When I called the HOA office, fully expecting someone to apologize for the mix-up and void the fine, the woman on the other end spoke with infuriating confidence. She said my lake, or at least the southern edge of it, still fell under community jurisdiction, based on an easement recorded in the original developer's plat map, something she claimed I would have known if I had read more carefully. During the purchase process, I told her that was ridiculous. I've reviewed my deed, I've paid for boundary surveys. My taxes go directly to the county and not a cent to the HOA. The lake is entirely enclosed by fencing I built myself, but none of that seemed to matter to them. I received 2 more letters within the next month. The second one hit me for $500 and the third came to $750. They were escalating, they said, because I was knowingly violating the rules after being notified. What rules? There's no mention in my deed or title report of shared access, no servitude rights, no legal claim to anything on my property. But what shook me to my core wasn't just the absurdity of the fines, it was the photos. Each letter came with grainy pictures of me fishing, drone footage showing me standing knee-deep on the dock, sometimes with my dog beside me, always alone, doing what I've done for years, enjoying the quiet. That's when I realized this wasn't just some clerical error. They were watching me. Someone had gone through the effort of flying a drone over my land, private, posted, no trespassing signs at every entry point, just to gather evidence against me. At first, I laughed. How could you not? The sheer insanity of it all made it seem like a sketch from some legal comedy. But when the drone came back a week later, hovering 20 feet above the water while I was fishing, I didn't laugh. I waved at it, walked back to the house, and grabbed my shotgun. I didn't fire, of course, but I made it crystal clear that this was harassment. That same day, I sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA through my attorney. He looked into the property records and, sure enough, found a vague easement clause tied to a long-defunct recreational association, which had somehow morphed over time into this aggressive HOA. The clause mentioned shared water access for community use, but no boundaries were specified, and the original association had dissolved before I ever bought the property. Still, the HOA was claiming successor rights. I argued back with documentation, survey maps, tax records, legal precedent, but they wouldn't back down. They said unless I submitted a formal petition for removal and paid a $2,000 release fee, the fines would continue. That's when I stopped taking them lightly. I reached out to a land use attorney with experience in rural property disputes. She was sharp, tenacious, and instantly saw the problem for what it was: a predatory HOA trying to extend its reach through outdated, ambiguous paperwork. She filed an injunction to prevent them from issuing further fines and launched a countersuit for harassment, trespassing via drone surveillance, and attempted extortion. Meanwhile, I installed security cameras, posted additional no trespassing signs, and even started documenting every time I fished, noting dates and times. My peaceful retreat, my little sanctuary, had turned into a legal battleground. Neighbors started asking questions. Some of them had received similar letters for things like keeping chickens or erecting sheds on what they thought was unregulated land. It became clear this HOA was casting a wide net, reinterpreting old documents to grab control of anything they could. One neighbor told me he'd paid over $1,500 in fines before even realizing he had a case to fight. It was exhausting, emotionally and financially. The lake that once brought me peace became a source of stress. Every ripple on the surface made me look up for drones. Every envelope in the mailbox raised my blood pressure. But I wasn't about to back down. This was my land. I'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and invested years of sweat equity to be bullied off my own property. The fight wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about the principle of ownership, the right to privacy, and the overreach of self-important boards that think they can enforce rules where they have no rightful claim. I didn't move to the country to get entangled in suburban politics. I came for the silence, the space, the freedom, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take that from me. The court date is set for next month. I'm ready. I decided to lawyer up. It was clear by then that this wasn't going to be solved by a few angry phone calls or strongly worded letters. After a couple of weeks digging through old plats, deeds, and easement agreements, my attorney finally found something interesting, something that explained where the HOA was getting their supposed authority. Years ago, they had quietly extended their reach by acquiring rights to several water bodies in the area under the guise of community recreational access. These were legacy agreements, dusty pages buried in county archives, inherited from the original developer who apparently had grand plans for a shared outdoor lifestyle across the whole valley. According to one of those old maps, a thin sliver of the lake property, just a narrow, swampy strip of land, was marked under the original jurisdiction back before it was even a lake. But here's the catch. That sliver wasn't even part of the current lake. Not anymore. After I purchased the land, I had taken what was essentially a seasonal drainage ditch choked with reeds and mosquitoes and spent real time, real money, and real sweat transforming it into something beautiful and functional. The lake now spanned more than triple its original area, fed by redirected spring runoff and reinforced with a series of retention berms and soil reinforcements that I had personally overseen. I stocked the fish, I dredged the bottom, I built the dock, I planted trees and restored the shoreline, and not once during any of those improvements did the HOA contribute a dime or send a single person out to maintain, inspect, or even inquire. The land they claimed was theirs had essentially been erased and replaced by my efforts. Yet here they were, waving around an outdated claim as if it were gospel, just to bully me into compliance. Legally, it was flimsy, but technically, it was enough for them to cause trouble. Enough for them to justify the harassment, the fines, the drone surveillance, the threats. That was the maddening part. How a sliver of ambiguous jurisdiction, forgotten for decades, could suddenly be resurrected to disrupt someone's life. And worse, it was obvious they were doing it to flex. This wasn't about rules or community fairness. It was about setting a precedent, making an example out of someone who had the nerve to push back. They thought I'd cave. They thought the pressure, the legal gray area, the costs of litigation would make me fold and simply stop fishing on my own property. That's when I got an idea. Not just a small, petty one, but a big one. Something that would flip the entire situation on its head. If they wanted to lean on old documents, then so could I. My attorney and I combed through every inch of my land's history, and what we found was pure gold, an old agricultural designation from before the HOA even existed, one that grandfathered in certain land use rights under county zoning laws. This meant, with a few paperwork updates and some strategic filings, I could apply to classify a portion of my land, specifically the expanded lake area, as an agricultural water reservoir with private use designation. Once registered, it would supersede the recreational easement claims entirely, rendering the HOA's arguments legally moot. But I didn't stop there. I decided to build. I drew up plans for a small boathouse and a lakeside pavilion, fully permitted, of course, along with a few signs that read, "Private agricultural use, no public access." Then I bought my own drone, not to spy, but to document everything. The progress, the upgrades, the clearly marked boundaries. Every time the HOA sent a letter, I sent back photographic evidence of legal compliance, backed by zoning documents and water board records. Then came the best part. I hosted a community awareness day. I invited neighboring landowners who had also been getting harassed by the HOA, gave them tours of the lake, explained how the old easements were being misused, and connected them with my attorney. Turns out, I wasn't the only one with a target on their back. The HOA had quietly been spreading its tendrils across the whole area, banking on fear and ignorance to keep people from fighting back. But not anymore. One neighbor had built a barn that they were being fined for. Another had chickens they were told to remove. With a little organizing, we started pushing back as a group. Petitions were filed, county board members were contacted, and a formal review of the HOA's extended jurisdiction was put on the agenda. The tide was turning. Still, the HOA wasn't done. They tried to fine me again, this time for unauthorized structure construction related to the boathouse, but by then my paperwork was airtight. The county inspector laughed when he saw the letter and filed a formal reprimand against the HOA for misrepresenting their authority. Every attempt they made to push forward was met with harder resistance, more organized responses, and increasingly, bad press. Local papers picked up the story. Rancher battles HOA over private lake, and the narrative wasn't in their favor. They had awakened something far bigger than they expected. I had started off alone, just a guy trying to enjoy a quiet day of fishing, and ended up becoming the figurehead of a community standing up to overreach. The last time the drone flew over my land, I sent a formal trespass notice to the HOA's lawyer and filed a complaint with the FAA for unauthorized aerial surveillance over private property. The fines stopped after that. The letters went silent. I don't know if they gave up for good, but I know they learned something important. You don't push people who know how to push back. You don't rely on outdated maps and scare tactics when your foundation is shaky at best, and you definitely don't try to claim someone else's lake, especially when that someone has receipts, allies, and a damn good lawyer. You see, the HOA's pride and joy, the one thing they all seemed to gather around with smug smiles and potlucks, was a modest little pond right in the heart of their neighborhood. It wasn't big, maybe 1.5 acres at most, but it was well maintained, surrounded by benches and a walking path, and served as the central hub for their community events. They held annual fishing contests there, summer BBQs, 4th of July fireworks, and even the occasional wedding under a white tent by the water's edge. It was their showpiece, the image they put in the community newsletter, and the feature photo on their website, as if it symbolized unity, charm, and the greatness of HOA living. So, while they were busy trying to make my life miserable with fines, threats, and drone flyovers, I started asking a few quiet questions. I reached out to a few real estate contacts and a local title researcher, wanting to know exactly who owned that precious little pond. And to my surprise, and genuine amusement, it turned out the HOA didn't own it at all. The land the pond sat on was privately owned, part of a parcel that had never been formally transferred to the association when the original developer divvied up the lots. The actual owner was a woman named Martha, who now lived in another state and was renting out the nearby house that sat just past the tree line. She had inherited the property from her late brother years ago, and from what I gathered, she had no emotional attachment to the pond or the land around it. In fact, when I finally got her on the phone, she said she'd been meaning to sell it for a while but didn't want to deal with all the red tape of negotiating with the HOA. She worried that once they knew the land wasn't theirs, they'd try to bully her or get it for cheap. I made her an offer right then and there, above market value, no games, all cash, immediate closing, with a clause that transferred everything, including mineral and water rights. She was thrilled. 3 weeks later, I held the deed in my hand. I was now the legal owner of the HOA's favorite fishing pond, the crown jewel of their community. The moment the sale closed, I posted bright red no trespassing signs all the way around the pond's perimeter, every 20 feet, just to make sure there was no ambiguity. I also hired a licensed security guard to patrol the area on weekends, especially during the times when they typically held events. The look on the neighbors' faces as they read the signs was priceless. Confusion, disbelief, and then slow-building panic. I didn't say a word at first. I let them come to me. I let them feel the sting of being locked out of something they'd taken for granted, something they assumed belonged to them just because they'd used it for years. But it wasn't enough to just block access. I wanted to send a message, one that echoed everything they'd tried to do to me. So I contacted a local water management expert and arranged to have the pond lowered by 4 feet. Not drained completely, just enough to make it unusable for fishing or any meaningful recreation. Fish relocated, shoreline exposed, muddy banks, and a shallow basin where clean water used to shimmer. I even put up temporary fencing while the work was done and sent a courtesy notice to the HOA stating that, as the new landowner, I was implementing environmental restoration efforts and would not permit public use due to liability concerns. That was all it took. 3 days later, the HOA president, a man who had signed every fine they'd mailed to me, showed up at my gate, red-faced and sputtering. He wanted to talk. He tried to play it cool at first, pretending like there'd been a misunderstanding. "Surely you know this pond is a vital part of our community," he said, as if I hadn't just bought it fair and square. I let him talk for a while, nodding politely as he danced around the topic of ownership, until I finally pulled out the deed and handed him a copy. "I know exactly who owns it," I said. "You're looking at him." He didn't know what to say. He stammered about how the residents had weddings planned, about how children learned to fish there, about how traditions were built around that pond. I just smiled and said, "Kind of like how I built a lake on my land and you tried to find me for fishing in it?" The silence that followed was exquisite. He asked if there was anything the HOA could do to regain access, maybe lease the pond, or establish a shared use agreement. I told him I'd consider it, but only after they dropped every fine they'd ever issued to me, issued a formal apology in writing, and acknowledged publicly that they had overstepped their authority. And even then, I said, I'd probably keep it closed for the foreseeable future, just to ensure proper rest for the ecosystem, of course. The real kicker came a week later, when the HOA had to cancel their annual summer festival because the venue, my pond, was no longer available. They tried to move it elsewhere, but nothing had the same appeal. The pond had been the backdrop. For all their pride, the thing they showed off to prospective homebuyers, the proof of their strong community spirit. Now it was fenced, muddy, and off-limits, and there was nothing they could do about it. I didn't need revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't yell or make threats. I just used the same tools they'd used on me, deeds, documents, quiet transactions, and turned their tactics right back at them. They wanted to control something that wasn't theirs? Fine. I took something they thought was theirs and reminded them what real ownership looks like. It's not about how long you've used something or how much you feel entitled to it. It's about who actually holds the rights, who pays the taxes, who signs the checks. The pond is mine now, and it will stay mine, dry, empty, and quiet, until I decide otherwise. The HOA went into a full-blown frenzy. The moment the signs went up around the pond, the ripples spread faster than I could have imagined. Residents were furious, not at me, but at the HOA board they had trusted for years without question. Suddenly, all those well-attended events they looked forward to, fishing contests, BBQs, family gatherings, neighborhood socials, were canceled without warning, replaced by uncertainty and frustration. Word spread like wildfire. People were showing up to the pond with coolers and lawn chairs, only to be turned away by a hired security guard who politely pointed to the bright red "No Trespassing" signs. Some tried to plead their case, claiming they'd used the pond for years. Others demanded answers from the HOA board, but the truth was no one had any actual ownership. The association had never officially purchased or assumed legal responsibility for the pond. They had just used it with a handshake agreement from the previous owner, who never really cared enough to interfere. That casual goodwill, that assumption of shared benefit, had vanished the second I bought the land. And with it, the HOA's entire facade of control crumbled. They tried everything to regain their footing. At first, they attempted negotiations, emailing and calling to propose some kind of leaseback arrangement, I listened, nodded, but never committed. Then came the more desperate attempts, veiled threats of legal action, claims of community necessity, and even suggestions that I was acting in bad faith. But my legal team had already been 3 steps ahead, and every move I made was by the book. They had no leg to stand on, no documentation, no precedent, no enforceable claim. Every single attempt to assert authority fell flat under the weight of the truth. They had never owned the pond in the first place. They had merely borrowed it, benefiting from a leniency they mistook for entitlement. It was almost comical to watch them scramble. The same board that had smugly sent me fines for fishing in my own lake was now publicly backpedaling, caught in the very net they'd tried to cast around me. Eventually, the HOA president himself reached out with a different tone. No more bluster, just carefully worded civility. He asked if I'd consider selling the pond back to the community, offering a decent price and promising to maintain it respectfully this time. I declined, politely but firmly. I told him it wasn't for sale, not now, and probably not ever. I could sense the shift immediately. Their confidence was broken, their illusion of control shattered. But I wasn't done. The true cherry on top came just a few weeks later, after what I can only imagine were a series of emergency meetings, internal votes, and perhaps a long, awkward conversation with a lawyer or two. I received a certified letter in the mail, this time not a fine, not a threat, but something entirely different. It was a formal public apology, a complete and total capitulation. In the letter, the HOA board acknowledged their error in claiming jurisdiction over part of my lake. They stated, in clear, unambiguous terms, that their previous enforcement attempts were based on outdated and incorrect documentation. They officially dropped all outstanding fines and penalties related to my property. But that wasn't all. They also filed a correction with the county records office, removing any reference to HOA oversight of my land, specifically the lake and its surrounding acreage. In doing so, they admitted, publicly and legally, that their claims had been unjustified from the start. The final paragraph of the letter nearly made me laugh aloud. It read something like, "We sincerely hope you will consider reopening access to the pond in light of this correction, as a gesture of goodwill to the community." There it was. The same people who had sent drones over my property and threatened me with escalating fines were now practically begging me to reverse course. As a final act of closure, they even refunded the original $300 fine that I had paid at the very beginning of this ridiculous saga. It came in the form of a check, attached to the apology letter with a neatly printed memo line that read, "Fine reimbursement, lake jurisdiction." I didn't cash it. Instead, I framed it along with the letter. I hung them both in my office right above the window that overlooks my now peaceful, quiet lake. It serves as a daily reminder, not of victory or spite, but of what happens when you stand your ground against those who assume they're untouchable. It reminds me that rights once defended carry weight. That owning something means protecting it, not just from natural wear and tear, but from people who will test the limits of your boundaries simply because they think they can. The pond remains off limits. The signs are still up. The water is calm, 4 feet lower than usual, and the fish are gone, relocated elsewhere. The community may one day come to terms with the new reality, or maybe they'll continue to harbor quiet resentment. Either way, the message is clear. This land, this lake, this pond, they're not just lines on a map or items in an HOA brochure. They're mine. And now, thanks to their own arrogance and overreach, there's a paper trail that ensures they can never forget it. Now, I'm not a spiteful man. I never set out to create conflict or stir up drama, but I do believe deeply in the principle of standing your ground when you know you're in the right. There's a line between defending what's yours and becoming vindictive, and I've tried to stay firmly on the side of the former. I didn't buy that pond out of malice or some grand desire to play the villain in the story of this quiet neighborhood. I bought it to prove a point, clear and simple. You don't bully your neighbors, especially when you're dead wrong. You don't fly drones over their private property, slap them with fines based on shaky paperwork, and expect them to roll over quietly. You don't abuse your imagined authority and then act surprised when someone calls your bluff. The day I closed on that pond and posted the signs, it wasn't about punishment. It was about boundaries. literal and figurative ones. It was about sending a message that entitlement doesn't trump ownership, and that kindness, like the kind the previous owner had shown by allowing the community to use the pond without hassle, isn't something to be taken for granted. Since then, things have quieted down considerably. The HOA has kept its distance, and not a single drone has flown over my property since. There have been no more letters, no more surprise visits, and certainly no more attempts to exercise authority they never had to begin with. Their apology, framed and hanging in my office, is all the reminder I need of how far they were willing to go before realizing they'd crossed a line. But over time, even my own feelings began to evolve. I wasn't interested in holding a grudge forever. I never intended to leave the pond dry and desolate just to make a point. I simply wanted respect, acknowledgement, and most importantly, peace. So after a while, I decided to reopen the pond, but not to the HOA. Not to the people who once believed they had ownership without responsibility. I opened it instead to the kinds of people who could truly appreciate it. I partnered with a few local schools, inviting students out on field trips to learn about ecology, fishing, and the quiet joys of nature. I reached out to local veterans groups and gave them access on weekends, letting them fish, picnic, and simply enjoy the peaceful setting that had once been the pride of a community that took it for granted. These were folks who respected boundaries, who understood what it meant to be invited guests rather than entitled users. And the best part? The community eventually understood too. Word got around about how I was using the pond, not to hoard it, but to share it with those who truly appreciated it. And somewhere in that shift, a kind of quiet respect was born. Neighbors who had once grumbled under their breath began waving when they drove by. Some even stopped to say thank you, not for keeping the pond closed, but for finding a way to make it meaningful again. The children's laughter on the banks, the quiet companionship of veterans casting lines together, it all restored something, deeper than just the waterline. It restored dignity, not just to the land, but to the entire situation. And as for my ranch lake, the one that started this whole ordeal, I fish there every Sunday morning like clockwork. No drones buzz overhead anymore. No surprise letters show up in the mailbox. No hollow threats dressed up as policy violations. Just me, my rod, the stillness of the morning, and the satisfaction of knowing that I defended what was mine without stooping to the level of those who tried to take it. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from watching the sunrise dance off the water you worked so hard to protect, knowing it's yours without question, without conflict, without noise. I don't fish for sport or for trophies. I fish because it reminds me who I am, where I draw the line, and how sometimes the best revenge doesn't come through words or confrontation. Sometimes the best revenge is ownership, the calm, unshakable, kind that's backed by deeds and patience and the long view of things. Owning the pond they thought was theirs wasn't just a victory in a legal sense. It was a statement of values. It was a quiet reclaiming of the space I'd carved out for myself, and a reminder that bullies only win when good people stay silent. I wasn't silent. I acted. And I did so with care, with foresight, and without malice. In the end, the HOA learned its lesson. The community learned something too. That authority must be earned, not assumed, and that respect isn't demanded with threats, but given freely when you treat people right. My pond stands as proof of that now. My lake stands even taller. And I stand proud, not because I won, but because I stayed true to myself while navigating a storm of pettiness and bureaucracy. I didn't fight to hurt anyone. I fought to be left alone, to fish in peace, to protect what was mine. And I did. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever dealt with an unreasonable Joe A. What would you have done in my shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. More unbelievable true tales are coming soon. This is Beyond Tale, where real stories go way beyond the ordinary.